Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most famous turning points in ancient history. It began with a man who seemed to have mastered fortune itself, and ended with a murder carried out in broad daylight by men who claimed they were saving their republic. What makes the story so enduring is that Julius Caesar was not killed by foreign enemies, or by a mob, or in the chaos of a battlefield. He was killed by senators, many of them men he knew, trusted, and had even forgiven. And behind that act was a question that still feels surprisingly modern. When does political power become so concentrated that people decide the old system can only be saved through extraordinary violence? And before we begin, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history told with patience and depth, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next long-form journey into the ancient world, and it really helps this kind of careful historical storytelling reach the people who enjoy it most. To understand why Julius Caesar was assassinated, we have to begin long before the Ides of March in 44 BC, because his death was not the result of one argument, one insult, or one sudden conspiracy. It was the final expression of a political crisis that had been developing inside the Roman Republic for generations. By Caesar's time, Rome had already become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. It had defeated rivals, absorbed vast territories, and grown rich beyond anything earlier Romans could have imagined. But that success brought strain. The institutions of the Republic had been designed for a city-state ruled by elected magistrates and guided by a senate made up of elite families. They were not designed to govern an empire stretching across continents, and they were certainly not designed to absorb enormous wealth, private armies, and men of exceptional personal ambition. Over time, Roman politics became harsher, more competitive, and more unstable. Powerful generals won glory abroad and brought home loyal soldiers who looked to them, not to the state, for rewards. Elections became more corrupt. Political alliances became more cynical. Old ideals were still spoken aloud, but increasingly they were used as language to justify struggles for influence. Men such as Marius and Sulla had already shown that Roman armies could be turned against Rome itself. Sulla, in particular, had marched on the city and ruled as dictator, leaving behind a grim precedent. Romans had seen what happened when one man seized exceptional power, and many never forgot it. Julius Caesar rose within this world with unusual brilliance. He was intelligent, charismatic, deeply ambitious, and exceptionally skilled at reading both crowds and elites. He understood ceremony, reputation, and the importance of appearing generous even while pursuing enormous personal power. He also came from an old patrician family, which gave him prestige, but not enough wealth to dominate politics on lineage alone. He had to build his career actively, and he did so through alliances, calculated public image, and relentless political energy. He became known as a remarkable speaker, a shrewd operator, and a man willing to take risks. His partnership with Pompey and Crassus, often called the First Triumvirate, helped transform Roman politics. It was not an official institution, but a private arrangement among three powerful men who could advance one another's interests. Caesar gained the consulship and, after it, command in Gaul. That command changed everything. In Gaul, Caesar built military prestige on a scale few Romans could match. His campaigns expanded Roman territory, enriched him, and made him famous throughout the Republic. More importantly, they gave him hardened, loyal legions. His own writings presented him as calm, rational, and necessary, but behind those polished accounts stood an unmistakable reality. Caesar was becoming too powerful to be treated as just another politician. Back in Rome, the balance that had protected him began to break down. Crassus died. Caesar's daughter Julia, who had married Pompey and helped maintain the bond between the two men, also died. Pompey drifted toward the senatorial establishment, and suspicion of Caesar deepened. Many senators feared that once his command ended, he would be prosecuted by his enemies and politically destroyed. Caesar, for his part, feared exactly that. He wanted to retain dignity, protection, and influence. His opponents wanted him stripped of command before he could threaten the Republic further. Neither side trusted the other, and Roman politics had become too personal and too militarized for a peaceful compromise to come easily. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, an act that effectively began civil war. This was one of the central reasons later conspirators believed he had to be stopped. By marching into Italy under arms, Caesar broke a crucial taboo. Roman governors were not meant to bring armies into the heart of Roman political life. Yet he did, claiming necessity, self-defense, and the rights of the tribunes. His enemies saw something else: a general using military force to settle political disputes. The civil war that followed ended with Caesar victorious. Pompey was defeated and later killed in Egypt. Resistance continued in different regions, but Caesar prevailed again and again. By the time he returned to Rome as master of the Roman world, the Republic's old constitutional balance had been shattered. Caesar then faced a problem that has confronted many victors in history. Winning power is one thing, making that power seem legitimate is another. He did not formally crown himself king, and that mattered because the Roman hatred of kingship ran very deep. The memory of Rome's ancient kings and of their expulsion remained part of Roman political identity. Romans could accept strong magistrates, emergency dictators, and dominant generals, but the word king was toxic. Caesar knew this. He presented himself as a restorer, a reformer, and a bringer of peace after civil war. He pardoned many former enemies. He carried out reforms in debt, administration, settlement, and the calendar. He expanded the Senate, reorganized provincial governance, and worked with extraordinary speed. To some, he looked like the one man capable of stabilizing a collapsing state. But to others, these same actions looked like the careful construction of monarchy under another name. Caesar accumulated offices and honors at a pace that alarmed even men who had once accepted his leadership. He was appointed dictator repeatedly and eventually dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. His image appeared in places that would once have seemed unthinkable for a living Roman statesman. He received honors that blurred the line between political authority and sacred status. He sat in a golden chair. He wore triumphal dress on public occasions. A temple was planned to Clementia Caesaris, the mercy of Caesar, elevating a personal virtue into something almost institutional. The Senate, or many within it, kept voting honors upon him, whether out of flattery, fear, calculation, or genuine support. Each honor may have seemed manageable on its own, but together they created a powerful impression that Caesar stood above the Republic rather than within it. One episode mattered especially because of what it suggested symbolically. At the festival of the Lupercalia, Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a diadem, the symbol of kingship. Caesar refused it, and the crowd reportedly approved. On the surface, this could be read as proof that he did not want to be king. But politically it changed little. The very fact that such a gesture could occur in public, and in connection with Caesar, intensified anxiety. Romans did not need a formal declaration to sense the direction of events. Many believed Caesar was testing public reaction, or allowing others to test it for him. Whether that was fair or not, suspicion grew. The conspiracy that formed against Caesar included men of different motives. Some were genuine defenders of Republican tradition, at least in their own minds. They believed that if Caesar lived, Rome would cease to be a republic in anything but name. Others were driven by wounded pride, exclusion, resentment, or personal disappointment. A political order dominated by one man left less room for aristocratic competition, and Roman senators had been raised in a culture that valued honor, status, and public influence intensely. To them, subordination was not merely inconvenient. It was humiliating. This mixture of principle and personal grievance made the plot both powerful and unstable. Among the leading conspirators were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. Cassius was experienced, capable, and deeply hostile to Caesar's dominance. Brutus gave the conspiracy moral weight. His name carried enormous symbolic significance because one of his ancestors, Lucius Junius Brutus, was associated in Roman memory with the overthrow of the kings and the founding of the Republic. That ancestry made Marcus Brutus an especially potent figure in any movement claiming to resist tyranny. Brutus also had a complicated personal relationship with Caesar. Caesar had shown him favor and clemency. That made his decision to join the conspirators all the more consequential. Later generations would focus heavily on Brutus because he embodied the tragedy of the assassination. Loyalty and principle, gratitude and fear, private relationship and public duty, all colliding in one man. So why was Caesar assassinated? The simplest answer is that many senators came to believe he had gathered so much permanent personal power that the Roman Republic could not survive him. But that answer needs refinement. Caesar was not killed merely because he was powerful. Other Romans had been powerful. He was killed because his power seemed irreversible, increasingly monarchical, and incompatible with the aristocratic political culture of the Republic. He had won a civil war, commanded armies personally loyal to him, accepted extraordinary honors, and occupied a position from which normal competition among elites no longer functioned. To men formed by Republican ideals, or at least by Republican habits, this appeared intolerable. To men motivated by rivalry and pride, it felt suffocating. The assassination was the moment where those fears and resentments fused into action. How was it done? The conspirators knew they could not defeat Caesar in open political struggle, and they could not easily move against him with armies of their own. They needed surprise, proximity, and a setting where weapons could be concealed and defenders kept at bay. The Senate meeting planned for the theater of Pompey offered that opportunity. Caesar would come with limited protection, surrounded by men he knew, in a context that seemed formally political rather than military. That was essential. The attack had to be close, sudden, and collective. No one conspirator wanted sole responsibility. By striking together, they made the murder a public political act rather than a private vendetta. On the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, they gathered and waited for him there. When Julius Caesar approached the Senate meeting on the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, nothing about the setting suggested that the Roman world was about to change forever. The Senate was not meeting in its traditional building that day, but in a hall attached to the theater of Pompey. The reason was practical. Parts of the usual Senate house were under renovation. Yet the symbolism was striking. Pompey, Caesar's former ally and later his enemy in the Civil War, had once dominated Roman politics himself. Now Caesar, the victor of that conflict, would enter a building associated with Pompey's legacy, unaware that it would soon become the scene of his assassination. Ancient writers describe the atmosphere in Rome during those days as tense but not openly chaotic. Caesar was preparing for a major military campaign against the Parthian Empire, and plans were already being discussed for his departure from the city. Some senators likely hoped that once he left Rome with an army again, political tensions might ease, at least temporarily. Others believed that if he departed with such immense authority still intact, the Republic might never regain control of its own political life. In their minds, the opportunity to act was limited. On the morning of the Ides of March, several small incidents, later remembered almost as omens, were said to have occurred. Roman historians writing afterward, particularly Plutarch and Suetonius, describe warnings, uneasy dreams, and attempts by friends to caution Caesar about possible danger. His wife Calpurnia reportedly dreamed that his statue had been struck down and that blood flowed from it. According to some accounts, she urged him not to attend the Senate meeting that day. There was also a famous warning attributed to a soothsayer who had supposedly advised Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Modern historians treat many of these stories carefully, because they were written after the assassination and may reflect a tendency among ancient authors to frame great events as if they were foretold. Still, whether or not these warnings occurred exactly as described, they illustrate something important about Roman storytelling. Romans often believed that extraordinary political events carried signs or signals beforehand, and writers shaped narratives to emphasize that belief. Despite any hesitation that morning, Caesar ultimately decided to go to the Senate. One of the conspirators, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, played a crucial role here. Decimus was a trusted associate of Caesar and had served with him during the Gallic Wars. Because of that trust, he was able to persuade Caesar that the meeting should not be delayed. He reportedly argued that it would appear arrogant or disrespectful to dismiss the Senate after senators had already assembled. In the delicate world of Roman honor and reputation, such an argument carried weight. So Caesar set out for the meeting, accompanied by attendants and followed by others moving through the city. The conspirators were already gathered at the Senate chamber. Each man carried a concealed dagger. Their plan depended on cooperation and timing. No single attacker could guarantee success, but if many struck at once, Caesar would have little chance to defend himself. When Caesar entered the chamber, the senators rose in respect, as was customary. The conspirators moved gradually closer around him. One of them, Lucius Tullius Cimber, approached Caesar with a petition. The request concerned the recall of Cimber's exiled brother. This was not unusual. Senators frequently approached powerful officials with petitions and requests during meetings. As Cimber presented the petition, he moved close enough to Caesar to initiate the attack. According to the traditional account, when Caesar refused the request, Cimber suddenly grabbed his toga, pulling it down from his shoulders. That action was the agreed signal. At that moment, the first blow was struck. The conspirator Publius Servilius Casca is often identified in ancient sources as delivering the initial stab. The attack was not immediately fatal. Caesar attempted to defend himself and reportedly caught Casca's arm. For a brief moment, the situation must have been chaotic and shocking. Senators nearby realized that something extraordinary was happening, while the conspirators pressed forward to carry out their plan. Then the rest of the attackers surged in. Approximately 23 wounds were inflicted during the assault. The conspirators surrounded Caesar and struck repeatedly, each man participating so that responsibility would be shared. Some blows likely landed awkwardly as the attackers struggled in close quarters. Ancient sources even report that one conspirator accidentally stabbed another during the confusion. Caesar eventually fell at the base of a statue of Pompey. Later writers emphasized this detail because of its dramatic symbolism. The conqueror of Pompey dying beneath Pompey's likeness. Whether that moment appeared as precisely as later described is uncertain, but the image became powerful in Roman memory. One of the most famous details associated with the assassination concerns Caesar's final words. The phrase "et tu, Brute," meaning "and you, Brutus," became widely known through later literature, particularly in Shakespeare's play. However, ancient sources are less clear. Some accounts say Caesar said nothing at all. Others suggest he spoke a brief phrase in Greek addressing Brutus. It is entirely possible that the moment was too chaotic for clear words to be remembered accurately. What is certain is that once Caesar collapsed, the conspirators withdrew, believing they had completed an act of political liberation. They reportedly shouted that Rome was free again. Yet the reaction inside the Senate chamber was not what they expected. Instead of immediate applause or celebration, panic spread. Many senators who had not been part of the plot fled the building in fear and confusion. Rome had witnessed assassinations before, but killing the most powerful man in the Roman world inside a Senate meeting was something unprecedented. Outside the chamber, word of the attack spread rapidly through the city. At first, people struggled to understand what had happened. Caesar had dominated Roman political life for years. His victories had ended civil war. His authority seemed immense and stable. The idea that he could simply be cut down in the middle of the Senate seemed almost unbelievable. The conspirators moved quickly to frame their actions. They presented themselves as liberators defending the Republic from tyranny. Some carried daggers openly through the streets as symbols of their deed. Their hope was that the Roman people would recognize the assassination as an act of political courage, restoring traditional republican government. But Rome was no longer the same republic it had been generations earlier. Many ordinary Romans had benefited from Caesar's policies, or at least believed he represented stability after years of civil conflict. He had distributed land to veterans, organized public games, and introduced reforms that affected everyday life. His popularity among sections of the population remained strong. Moreover, the conspirators had underestimated how deeply Caesar's network of allies still extended through Roman politics and the army. Men such as Mark Antony, Caesar's close supporter and colleague, remained powerful figures. Antony had been scheduled to attend the Senate meeting that day, but was deliberately delayed outside the chamber by one of the conspirators, so he could not intervene. After the assassination, Antony initially fled, fearing he might also be targeted. But he soon realized that the situation was far from settled. The conspirators had eliminated Caesar, but they had not eliminated the political forces that had elevated him. In the hours and days that followed, Rome entered a period of uncertainty. The conspirators occupied the Capitol Hill, believing it offered protection while they waited for public reaction. They issued statements declaring their loyalty to the Republic. Yet they lacked a clear plan for what should happen next. This would prove to be one of their greatest mistakes. They had removed the man who dominated Roman politics, but they had not dismantled the structures of loyalty, ambition, and rivalry that surrounded him. In fact, by killing Caesar without fully controlling the aftermath, they unleashed a new and even more dangerous struggle for power. Within days, Caesar's will was read publicly. It revealed that he had adopted his young grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, as his heir. The young man would soon become known as Octavian, and his arrival would transform the consequences of the Ides of March in ways the conspirators could never have predicted. Because in trying to save the Roman Republic by killing Julius Caesar, they had instead opened the door to the final collapse of the Republic itself. And the next phase of that story, how Caesar's death ignited a new cycle of civil wars that eventually produced the Roman Empire, is just as dramatic as the assassination that began it. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Rome did not erupt into the celebration that the conspirators had hoped for. Instead, the city entered a strange and uneasy silence. Julius Caesar had dominated Roman politics for nearly a decade. His image, his authority, and his influence had become deeply embedded in the daily life of the Republic. Removing him so suddenly created a vacuum that no one quite knew how to fill. The conspirators, who began calling themselves liberatores, believed that their actions would inspire the Roman people to reclaim their traditional political freedoms. Many of them were members of Rome's most respected aristocratic families. They assumed that once Caesar was gone, the Republic's institutions, the Senate, the magistracies, and the system of elections would simply resume their proper roles. But the world they imagined restoring had already changed beyond recognition. In the streets of Rome, people reacted with uncertainty and fear rather than enthusiasm. The assassination had taken place inside the Senate, the symbolic heart of Roman political life. Yet it had not been carried out with the support of the broader population, nor with the backing of armies stationed nearby. For ordinary citizens, the sudden murder of the most powerful man in the state raised troubling questions. Was this the beginning of another civil war? Would rival factions now begin fighting again in the streets of Rome? Many people chose to remain indoors, waiting to see what would happen next. Meanwhile, Mark Antony emerged as one of the most important figures in the unfolding crisis. Antony had been Caesar's ally for many years. A capable soldier and an experienced political operator, he had served as consul alongside Caesar in 44 BC. On the day of the assassination, he had narrowly avoided death himself. One of the conspirators had deliberately kept him occupied outside the Senate chamber to prevent him from intervening during the attack. Once the assassination was complete, Antony wisely withdrew at first. His survival depended on understanding the balance of power. If the conspirators had widespread support among the Senate and the Roman people, direct confrontation might have been dangerous. But Antony quickly realized something important. Although Caesar was dead, the conspirators had not secured control of the government. In fact, they seemed uncertain about what to do next. For several days, a tense negotiation unfolded between the conspirators and Caesar's political allies. The Roman state could not simply stop functioning. Decisions had to be made about leadership, law, and order. Antony, acting carefully, positioned himself as a mediator between the two sides. Eventually, a temporary compromise was reached. The Senate would grant amnesty to the assassins, meaning they would not be prosecuted for Caesar's murder. In return, the conspirators agreed that all of Caesar's political decisions and appointments would remain legally valid. This agreement was intended to prevent immediate chaos. If Caesar's laws and reforms were suddenly overturned, the entire administrative structure of Rome could collapse. But beneath this compromise, tensions remained dangerously high. One of the most consequential moments came during Caesar's public funeral. The conspirators had allowed the funeral to proceed, believing that a controlled ceremony might calm the population. They underestimated the emotional connection many Romans felt toward Caesar. For years he had presented himself not only as a powerful leader but also as a benefactor of the people. His victories had brought wealth into the city. His reforms had affected debt, land distribution, and the structure of the calendar itself. At the funeral, Mark Antony delivered a speech that would become one of the most famous moments in Roman political history. Ancient accounts describe Antony standing before the gathered crowd and speaking with careful calculation. Rather than openly attacking the conspirators, he began by praising Caesar's achievements and recalling his generosity toward Rome. He read aloud portions of Caesar's will, which contained an unexpected gesture. Caesar had left money to every citizen of Rome. He had also bequeathed his private gardens along the Tiber River to the public. This revelation transformed the mood of the crowd. To many ordinary Romans, Caesar was no longer merely a distant political figure. He had personally remembered them in his final wishes. The generosity described in the will reinforced the image Caesar had cultivated throughout his career, that of a leader who cared for the people. Antony then reportedly displayed Caesar's blood-stained clothing to the crowd, pointing to the wounds inflicted by the conspirators. Each tear in the fabric represented a senator's blade. The visual impact was powerful and immediate. The crowd, already stirred by Antony's words, became increasingly emotional. What had begun as a formal funeral turned into a public outpouring of anger and grief. Soon the gathering crowd carried Caesar's body through the streets and built an improvised funeral pyre in the Roman Forum itself. Flames rose into the air as people mourned and shouted in outrage. Some individuals even began searching for the houses of the conspirators. The liberatores quickly realized that public opinion was turning against them. Instead of being welcomed as defenders of the Republic, they were now viewed by many citizens as the murderers of a popular leader. The city had become dangerous for them. One by one, the conspirators began leaving Rome, traveling eastward to provinces where they hoped to gather military support. Yet even as they departed, a new political force was quietly emerging. Caesar's will had revealed that his adopted son and heir was a young man named Gaius Octavius. At the time of Caesar's death, Octavius was only 18 years old and studying in the Greek city of Apollonia, preparing for the upcoming Parthian campaign. When news of the assassination reached him, Octavius made a decision that surprised many observers. Instead of remaining safely away from Rome, he chose to return. This was an extraordinarily bold move. The political environment in Rome had become volatile and dangerous. Powerful generals, experienced politicians, and ambitious senators were already maneuvering for influence. Octavius, by contrast, was young and largely unknown in Roman political life. But he possessed two critical advantages. First, Caesar had formally adopted him as his son in his will, which legally made him Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. This connection to Caesar's name immediately gave him prestige and recognition. Second, he displayed a calm, calculating intelligence that would soon become one of the defining traits of his career. When Octavian arrived in Italy, he began quietly building alliances. At first, Mark Antony underestimated him. Antony likely believed that the young heir could be controlled or ignored, but Octavian proved far more capable than expected. He began appealing directly to Caesar's former soldiers, reminding them of their loyalty to the man who had led them to victory. Many veterans responded positively. Gradually, Octavian assembled his own network of supporters. Meanwhile, the Roman world continued sliding toward conflict. The conspirators in the eastern provinces were raising armies of their own. Antony remained powerful in Rome. Octavian was gaining influence among Caesar's former supporters. The fragile compromise that had followed the assassination could not hold indefinitely. By 43 BC, the tension erupted into open warfare once again. The Roman Republic had now entered the final phase of its long political crisis. Ironically, the assassination that had been intended to save the Republic had instead accelerated its collapse. The men who had stabbed Caesar believed they were preventing the rise of monarchy. Yet the violence they unleashed made it increasingly clear that Rome's traditional system could no longer manage the ambitions of its most powerful leaders. Within a few years, the struggle for power would produce a new political arrangement, one that looked outwardly like the Republic but in reality concentrated authority in the hands of a single ruler. That ruler would be Octavian, and under a new title, Augustus, he would become the first emperor of Rome. But the path from Caesar's assassination to the birth of the Roman Empire was neither quick nor peaceful. It would pass through another series of civil wars, political betrayals, and shifting alliances that reshaped the Mediterranean world forever. And in many ways, it all began in that Senate chamber on the Ides of March, when a group of senators believed that killing one man could restore the republic they remembered. In the months following Caesar's assassination, the Roman Republic entered one of the most unstable periods in its long history. The conspirators who had carried out the attack believed they had removed a tyrant. Yet the deeper political crisis that had allowed Caesar to rise remained unresolved. Power still rested in the hands of ambitious generals, loyal armies, and political alliances that could shift quickly and violently. At first, many senators hoped the Republic's traditional institutions might recover. After all, Caesar had been the dominant figure. Without him, perhaps the balance between Senate and magistrates could be restored. But that expectation underestimated how much the political landscape had already changed. The The civil wars of the previous decades had transformed Roman politics. Armies now followed generals personally. Soldiers expected land, wealth, and recognition from the commanders they had served. Loyalty to the Republic as an abstract system was no longer the primary force binding the Roman state together. As the conspirators left Rome and moved eastward, they began gathering support in the provinces. Marcus Brutus traveled to Greece and Asia Minor, while Cassius established his influence in Syria. These eastern territories were wealthy and strategically important. If the liberatores could secure enough resources and soldiers there, they believed they might eventually march back toward Italy and restore the Republic by force. Meanwhile, events in Rome continued to evolve rapidly. Mark Antony initially held a strong position. As consul and a longtime ally of Caesar, he controlled important political mechanisms in the city. He also possessed the authority to implement or interpret many of Caesar's unfinished plans. But Antony faced challenges. The most surprising of these came from the young Octavian. Octavian's arrival in Italy had been quiet, but his ambitions were not. Although he was only 18 years old, he demonstrated an extraordinary ability to read political circumstances. He immediately accepted Caesar's adoption and inheritance, taking the name Gaius Julius Caesar. This decision was more than symbolic. In Roman culture, names carried immense importance. By presenting himself as Caesar's legitimate heir, Octavian placed himself at the center of Caesar's political legacy. He also began distributing the money Caesar had promised to the citizens of Rome in his will. This was a carefully calculated act. By fulfilling Caesar's final promises, Octavian reinforced the perception that he was continuing Caesar's relationship with the Roman people. At the same time, he began recruiting soldiers among Caesar's veterans. Many of these men had fought for Caesar during the civil wars and still felt loyalty to his memory. Octavian's youth might have made him appear harmless to experienced politicians like Antony, but the loyalty of veteran soldiers gave him real influence. Soon tensions between Antony and Octavian began to grow. Antony had expected to inherit Caesar's political position naturally, but Octavian's presence complicated that assumption. The young heir was quietly building his own base of support, appealing both to Caesar's veterans and to senators who feared Antony might become too powerful. In an unexpected turn of events, Octavian temporarily aligned himself with members of the Senate who had opposed Caesar's dictatorship. Among them was Cicero, the famous orator and philosopher. Cicero had long supported the ideals of the Republic and saw Antony as a potential threat. He believed that, by supporting Octavian, he might balance Antony's power and restore the Senate's influence. This alliance was uneasy and temporary, but it allowed Octavian to gain legitimacy within Roman politics. By 43 BC, open conflict erupted again. Antony marched north toward the region of Cisalpine Gaul, where one of Caesar's former governors resisted his authority. The Senate declared Antony an enemy of the state and sent forces against him. including troops associated with Octavian. Two major battles were fought near the city of Mutina. Although Antony's forces were eventually pushed back, the victories came at a heavy cost. Both of the consuls leading the Senate's armies were killed during the fighting. Their deaths created yet another power vacuum. Octavian quickly recognized the opportunity. With the consuls gone, he now commanded a large army composed of experienced veterans. The Senate had hoped to control him, but controlling an ambitious young commander backed by loyal troops was not simple. Octavian marched toward Rome and demanded the consulship for himself. Despite his youth, he was not yet 20. He was elected consul in 43 BC. This moment marked a turning point. Octavian was no longer merely Caesar's heir. He had become a central figure in Roman politics. Soon afterward, Octavian and Antony made a surprising decision. Instead of continuing their rivalry, they formed an alliance. Together with a third powerful leader, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, they created what became known as the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this arrangement was not merely an informal political partnership. It was legalized by Roman law. The three men were granted extraordinary authority to reorganize the state. Their official title was Triumviri Rei Publici Constituendi, 3 men for restoring the Republic. In practice, however, their rule resembled something closer to military dictatorship. One of their first actions was the creation of proscriptions. These were official lists of individuals declared enemies of the state. Anyone whose name appeared on the list could be killed without legal consequence. Their property would be confiscated and distributed among the triumvirs and their supporters. Proscriptions had been used earlier by Sulla, and they were deeply feared throughout Roman society. Hundreds of senators and wealthy citizens were targeted. Some were killed for political reasons, others for their wealth. Among the victims was Cicero, who had spoken openly against Antony. His death symbolized the tragic fate of many who had hoped the Republic might survive. With Rome firmly under their control, the triumvirs turned their attention to the east, where Brutus and Cassius had assembled large armies. The confrontation that followed would determine the future of the Roman world. In 42 BC, the two sides met in northern Greece near the city of Philippi. The armies that gathered there were enormous. Tens of thousands of soldiers stood on each side, many of them Roman citizens fighting against other Romans. The civil wars that had begun decades earlier were reaching their final and decisive stage. 2 major battles were fought at Philippi. During the first clash, Brutus's forces achieved some success against Octavian's army, while Antony defeated Cassius on another part of the battlefield. Believing the situation hopeless, Cassius took his own life. Weeks later, the second battle took place. This time, the forces of Antony and Octavian achieved a decisive victory. Brutus also chose suicide rather than capture. With the deaths of Brutus and Cassius, the last major defenders of the Republican cause were gone. The men who had assassinated Caesar, believing they could restore the old republic, had failed. Instead of preventing the concentration of power in a single leader, their actions had led to a new political structure dominated by powerful military rulers. The Roman Republic, in the form that had existed for nearly 5 centuries, was effectively finished. Yet the story was not over. The alliance between Octavian and Antony would not last forever. As the years passed, rivalry between them grew steadily. Each controlled vast territories, armies, and wealth. Eventually, their uneasy partnership would collapse into another conflict, one that would determine who would ultimately rule Rome. When that struggle ended, Octavian would emerge as the sole master of the Roman world. And under the name Augustus, he would quietly reshape the Roman state into something entirely new, an empire ruled by a single man, though still dressed in the language of the Republic. In that sense, the assassination of Julius Caesar did not stop the rise of one-man rule in Rome. It ensured it. The victory at Philippi in 42 BC seemed, at first glance, to settle the question of Caesar's assassination and its consequences. The men most directly responsible for the plot, Brutus and Cassius, were gone. Their armies had been defeated, their cause scattered. For many Romans, the civil wars that had begun with Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon appeared to have reached their conclusion. But the deeper struggle for power within the Roman world was far from over. After Philippi, the victors divided control of the Roman territories between them. Mark Antony took responsibility for the eastern provinces, which included Greece, Asia Minor, and the wealthy lands surrounding the eastern Mediterranean. These regions were rich in resources and strategically important, particularly because Rome still faced the potential threat of the Parthian Empire to the east. Octavian, meanwhile, returned west to oversee Italy and the western provinces. Lepidus, the third member of the triumvirate, received control of North Africa. At first, this division seemed practical. Each leader would manage a different portion of the Roman world, reducing the immediate risk of conflict between them. Yet this arrangement also contained the seeds of future rivalry. Octavian's position in the West was particularly difficult. Italy had suffered greatly during the long years of civil war. Thousands of soldiers who had fought in the campaigns expected rewards, especially land. Roman tradition required that veterans be settled with farmland after their service, but finding land in Italy meant displacing existing communities. Octavian had to supervise this sensitive and often unpopular process. Land was confiscated and redistributed to soldiers, which caused resentment among many Italian landowners and farmers. These tensions occasionally erupted into local unrest. At the same time, Octavian had to maintain political stability in Rome itself, where memories of recent violence remained fresh. Mark Antony faced different challenges in the East. The eastern provinces were wealthy but politically complex. They contained many cities with long traditions of autonomy, as well as local rulers whose loyalty to Rome depended on careful diplomacy. One of the most famous figures Antony encountered during this period was Cleopatra VII, the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra had previously been involved with Julius Caesar during his time in Egypt. Their alliance had strengthened her position on the Egyptian throne. After Caesar's death, Cleopatra needed to maintain favorable relations with the new Roman leadership. Antony summoned her to meet him in 41 BC in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey. Ancient writers describe Cleopatra arriving with extraordinary ceremony. Her ship was said to have been decorated with rich fabrics and golden ornaments, presenting an image of royal magnificence designed to impress the Roman general. While these descriptions were likely embellished by later historians, there is little doubt that Cleopatra understood the importance of political theater. Her meeting with Antony soon developed into both a political alliance and a personal relationship. For Antony, Egypt offered resources, wealth, and naval support that could strengthen his position within the Roman world. For Cleopatra, Antony represented a powerful protector who could help secure Egypt's independence within the Roman sphere. Their partnership would later become one of the most famous relationships in ancient history. Yet, at the time, it was primarily a strategic arrangement shaped by the realities of power and survival. Back in the West, Octavian continued consolidating his authority. Although he had once presented himself as a supporter of the Senate against Antony, circumstances gradually pushed him toward a different role. He began cultivating an image of stability, discipline, and loyalty to Roman tradition. Octavian understood that legitimacy in Roman politics required more than military strength. It required careful presentation. He avoided the appearance of monarchy that had caused such suspicion toward Caesar. Instead, he emphasized the idea that he was restoring order after years of chaos. Meanwhile, the relationship between Octavian and Antony slowly deteriorated. At first, both men attempted to preserve their alliance through political arrangements. In 40 BC, a treaty known as the Pact of Brundisium temporarily resolved tensions. As part of the agreement, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. This marriage was intended to strengthen the bond between the two leaders and reassure their supporters that cooperation would continue. For several years, the arrangement seemed to work, but beneath the surface, mistrust continued to grow. Antony spent increasing amounts of time in the eastern provinces, where his alliance with Cleopatra deepened. He relied on Egypt's resources to support his campaigns and administrative efforts. To some Romans in the West, this raised concerns. Egypt was not a Roman province, but an independent kingdom ruled by a foreign queen. Antony's close relationship with Cleopatra began to appear politically suspicious. Octavian recognized the opportunity this situation presented. Gradually, he began shaping a narrative that portrayed Antony as drifting away from Roman values. According to this narrative, Antony had fallen under Cleopatra's influence and was prioritizing Eastern interests over those of Rome. Whether this portrayal was entirely fair or not, it proved politically effective. Octavian controlled much of the political messaging in Italy. Through speeches, public statements, and carefully managed rumors, he encouraged the idea that Antony was becoming increasingly un-Roman in his behavior. Tensions escalated dramatically in the late 30s BC. One of the most controversial moments occurred in 34 BC during what became known as the Donations of Alexandria. At a grand ceremony in Egypt, Antony and Cleopatra publicly distributed territories among Cleopatra's children. Some of these lands technically belonged to Rome or were within its sphere of influence. To Octavian and his supporters, this appeared as proof that Antony intended to create a new political order centered on Egypt rather than Rome. Octavian seized on the moment. He obtained a copy of Antony's will, which had been stored with the Vestal Virgins in Rome. The contents were explosive. According to Octavian's claims, Antony's will included instructions that he wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. Whether this detail was presented accurately or manipulated for political purposes remains debated by historians. But in the charged political atmosphere of Rome, the message was powerful. Octavian presented Antony not merely as a rival, but as a man who had abandoned Rome in favor of a foreign queen. The Senate eventually declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. This framing allowed Octavian to present the conflict as a defense of Rome against Eastern domination rather than another Roman civil war. Yet everyone understood that Antony himself was the true opponent. The final confrontation came in 31 BC near the western coast of Greece. At the naval battle of Actium, Octavian's forces were commanded by his trusted general Marcus Agrippa, an exceptionally skilled military leader. Antony and Cleopatra commanded a large fleet, but their position was difficult. Their forces were stretched, and supplies were becoming uncertain. The battle itself was complex and lasted several hours. Ultimately, the fleet commanded by Agrippa gained the advantage. In a dramatic moment that later historians would remember vividly, Cleopatra's ships broke away from the battle and sailed southward. Antony followed shortly afterward, abandoning the main engagement. Octavian's forces claimed victory. The defeat at Actium effectively ended Antony's chances of competing for control of the Roman world. Within a year, Octavian's armies advanced into Egypt itself. Facing inevitable defeat, Antony and Cleopatra both took their own lives in 30 BC. With their deaths, the last major rival to Octavian's power disappeared. For the first time since the death of Julius Caesar, one man stood unchallenged at the head of the Roman state. Yet Octavian understood the lessons of Caesar's fate very clearly. If he ruled too openly as a monarch, he might provoke the same fears that had led to the Ides of March. Instead, he carefully reshaped Roman political life in a way that preserved the outward appearance of the Republic while concentrating real authority in his own hands. In 27 BC, the Senate granted him a new title, Augustus. The Roman Republic in its old form was gone, but the Roman Empire had begun. And in the quiet background of that transformation stood the memory of a single moment, the assassination of Julius Caesar, an act meant to save the Republic that had instead helped bring about its final end. By the time Octavian received the title Augustus in 27 BC, Rome had entered a new political era. The civil wars that followed Julius Caesar's assassination had lasted more than a decade and had reshaped the Roman world in ways the conspirators of the Ides of March could never have predicted. Their intention had been to restore the Republic. Instead, their actions helped accelerate its transformation into a new system of rule centered on a single leader. What made Augustus's rise remarkable was the way he managed to avoid the mistakes that had led to Caesar's death. Julius Caesar had accumulated honors and powers so openly that many senators believed the Republic itself was being replaced. Augustus, by contrast, adopted a far more careful strategy. Rather than presenting himself as a king or dictator, he framed his authority as a restoration of the Republic. In public ceremonies, Augustus repeatedly emphasized that he had returned power to the Senate and the Roman people. Officially, the traditional institutions of the Republic continued to exist. The Senate still met. Magistrates were still elected. Laws were still debated. Yet behind these familiar structures, real authority increasingly rested with Augustus. He controlled the most important provinces of the empire, those where the majority of Roman legions were stationed. This meant that the military power of Rome ultimately answered to him. At the same time, he held key political offices and accumulated special powers granted by the Senate. These powers allowed him to influence legislation, oversee administration, and intervene in political matters across the empire. The result was a system historians often describe as the Principate. Augustus referred to himself as princeps, meaning first citizen, rather than emperor or king. The title suggested leadership within the Republic rather than domination over it. In reality, however, the Roman state had entered a form of monarchy in all but name. For many Romans, this arrangement was acceptable, perhaps even welcome. After decades of civil war, stability had enormous value. Augustus presided over a long period of relative peace and administrative reform known as the Pax Romana or Roman peace. Cities were rebuilt. Trade expanded. Roads and infrastructure improved across the empire. Cultural life flourished, with writers such as Virgil, Horace, and Ovid producing works that celebrated Rome's history and destiny. Augustus also carefully shaped the public memory of Julius Caesar. Caesar himself was officially deified by the Roman state, becoming Divus Julius, the divine Julius. This declaration carried important political implications. If Caesar was a god, then Augustus, as his adopted son, could claim a special relationship with divine authority. Temples were built in Caesar's honor, and religious ceremonies acknowledged his divine status. The comet that appeared shortly after Caesar's death during public games was interpreted by many Romans as a sign of his soul ascending to the heavens. For Augustus, This symbolism strengthened his legitimacy while avoiding the appearance of personal monarchy that had alarmed the conspirators. In a sense, Caesar's assassination had created both a warning and an opportunity. The warning was clear. Roman elites would resist any leader who appeared to destroy the traditional republic openly. The opportunity lay in designing a system that concentrated power quietly while preserving republican language and rituals. Augustus mastered that balance. Meanwhile, the legacy of the assassination continued to shape Roman political thought. The men who had killed Caesar were remembered in very different ways depending on the perspective of the writer or the political climate of the time. Some saw Brutus and Cassius as defenders of liberty who had tried to prevent tyranny. Others viewed them as short-sighted conspirators whose actions plunged Rome into further chaos. Ancient historians themselves often struggled with this question. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the events, portrayed Brutus as a man driven by ideals and philosophical convictions. He emphasized Brutus's reputation for integrity and his belief that Caesar's growing power threatened the Republic. At the same time, Plutarch acknowledged the tragic consequences of the assassination. Instead of restoring liberty, the conspirators unleashed forces they could not control. Suetonius, another Roman writer, approached the story with a focus on personalities and dramatic details. His account preserved many of the famous elements associated with the assassination: the warnings, the final moments in the Senate, and the famous phrase attributed to Caesar upon seeing Brutus among the attackers. Modern historians approach these ancient accounts with caution. Many were written decades or even centuries after the events, shaped by political agendas and literary traditions. Yet the central facts remain clear. Julius Caesar was assassinated because a group of Roman senators believed his growing authority threatened the Republic's traditional political order. They acted in the hope that removing him would restore the balance between Senate and magistrates that had defined Roman governance for centuries. But the republic they hoped to save had already been weakened by long-term structural problems. The Roman state had expanded far beyond the political system designed to manage it. Military power had become increasingly personal, tied to individual generals rather than the state itself. Political competition among elites had grown more intense and more violent. In that environment, removing one powerful leader could not restore stability. Instead, the assassination created a power vacuum that intensified existing rivalries. The civil wars that followed ultimately produced a new political structure in which a single ruler governed the Roman world. Augustus's system proved durable. The Roman Empire would continue, in various forms, for centuries. And yet the memory of the Ides of March never disappeared from Roman culture. Even under the emperors, the assassination of Caesar remained a powerful symbol of the tension between liberty and authority. Writers, philosophers, and historians continued to debate whether the conspirators had been heroes or misguided idealists. The event itself became one of the most studied and retold moments in ancient history. Part of its enduring fascination lies in the human drama involved. Julius Caesar was not merely a distant ruler. He was a brilliant general, an influential reformer, and a political figure who reshaped the Roman world. His assassination brought together ambition, fear, loyalty, and ideology in a single moment of violence. Brutus, the conspirator whose name became most closely associated with the plot, represented the conflict between personal relationships and political conviction. Caesar had shown him clemency and trust, yet Brutus ultimately joined the conspiracy that ended his life. Cassius embodied another aspect of Roman political culture: deep resentment toward the concentration of power and the loss of aristocratic independence. Mark Antony and Octavian represented the next generation of Roman leadership, shaped by the aftermath of Caesar's death. Through them, the consequences of the assassination continued to unfold across the Mediterranean world. Looking back across 2,000 years, the assassination of Julius Caesar stands as one of the most significant political murders in recorded history. It marked the end of one political system and helped give birth to another. The conspirators believed they were defending the Roman Republic. Instead, they helped clear the path for the Roman Empire. And in that sense, the events of the Ides of March remind us of a recurring lesson in history. Political actions taken to preserve a system can sometimes accelerate its transformation. The men who raised their daggers in the Senate chamber believed they were striking down tyranny. But what followed their act would shape the future of Rome and much of the world for centuries to come. We had just reached the moment where the Roman world had transformed from republic to empire under Augustus, the adopted son of Julius Caesar. But the story of Caesar's assassination does not truly end with the death of the conspirators or the rise of Augustus. In many ways, its deeper legacy lies in how later generations of Romans, and eventually the wider world, understood what had happened on the Ides of March. Because Caesar's death quickly became more than a political event. It became a symbol. For the Romans who lived under the early emperors, the memory of the assassination represented a complicated question about power. The Republic had once been proud of its system of shared authority, where no single man was meant to dominate the state for long. Magistrates served limited terms, the Senate debated policy, and rival aristocratic families competed for prestige. Yet the growth of Rome's empire had gradually stretched that system beyond its limits. By the 1st century BC, Rome governed territories that extended from Spain to Syria, from North Africa to the forests of Gaul. Administering such a vast world required coordination, military strength, and long-term planning that the old republican structure struggled to provide. Political leaders increasingly relied on personal networks of soldiers and supporters rather than on the state itself. Julius Caesar was both a product of that environment and one of its most dramatic expressions. He possessed extraordinary personal abilities, military brilliance, political instinct, and a talent for public communication. His victories in Gaul had not only expanded Roman territory but also reshaped his reputation. Roman citizens across the Mediterranean knew his name. His soldiers trusted him, His writings about the Gallic Wars circulated widely, presenting him as a calm, rational commander bringing order to distant lands. But success created suspicion. For the Roman aristocracy, prestige was supposed to be shared among many families. Caesar's dominance threatened that balance. When he crossed the Rubicon and marched into Italy, he demonstrated something that could not easily be reversed. A Roman general with loyal armies could decide the fate of the Republic. That moment frightened many senators far more than any particular reform Caesar introduced later. By the time he became dictator for life, the political landscape had already shifted. Caesar may have believed he was stabilizing the state after civil war. Yet to his opponents, the appearance of permanent authority suggested the end of republican liberty. The conspirators convinced themselves that killing Caesar would restore the old system. History proved otherwise. The republic they hoped to revive depended on political habits that had already eroded. Trust between rival elites had been shattered by decades of conflict. Armies were loyal to generals rather than institutions. Provincial wealth had made Roman politics increasingly competitive and personal. Removing Caesar did not remove those conditions. Instead, the assassination intensified them. The power struggle that followed created opportunities for figures like Mark Antony and Octavian to claim leadership over Caesar's legacy. Their rivalry, and the wars that followed, revealed something fundamental about Rome's situation. The Republic no longer had the internal stability to manage disputes peacefully among powerful leaders. When Augustus finally established his new political system, many Romans accepted it not because they loved monarchy, but because they were exhausted by civil war. Stability became more valuable than constitutional purity. Augustus understood this sentiment very well. Unlike Caesar, he moved carefully. He avoided titles that suggested kingship. He maintained the outward forms of republican government while quietly concentrating authority in his own hands. Senators continued to debate matters of state, but Augustus held ultimate influence through his control of the army, the provinces, and key political powers. For ordinary Romans, daily life under Augustus often felt calmer than during the final years of the Republic. Trade expanded across the Mediterranean. Infrastructure projects improved roads and cities. New colonies were founded for veterans. The Roman legal system became more organized and predictable. Cultural life flourished, supported by wealthy patrons and imperial encouragement. Yet beneath that stability, the political transformation was unmistakable. The Roman Empire had begun, and the assassination of Julius Caesar stood at the center of that transformation. Over time, the story of the Ides of March took on a life of its own. Roman writers revisited the event repeatedly, each emphasizing different themes. Some focused on Caesar's ambition. Others emphasized the moral struggle of Brutus. Still others explored the political consequences of the assassination. Plutarch, writing in the early 2nd century AD, presented the story through biographies of the major figures involved. His account portrays Brutus as a man torn between personal loyalty and philosophical belief. According to Plutarch, Brutus admired the ideals of the Republic deeply and believed that Caesar's growing power threatened those principles. Another historian, Appian, examined the broader political consequences. His work described how the assassination plunged Rome into another round of civil wars. In his view, the conspirators failed not because their motives were entirely misguided, but because they underestimated the forces they had unleashed. Suetonius, writing under the Roman emperors, focused on vivid details of Caesar's life and death. His descriptions helped preserve many of the famous elements associated with the assassination. The warning Caesar reportedly received, the sudden attack in the Senate chamber, and the dramatic final moments before his collapse. These narratives, though shaped by literary style and later interpretation, ensured that the assassination remained one of the most remembered events of Roman history. Centuries later, the story would gain renewed attention during the Renaissance and early modern period. Scholars rediscovered classical texts and began studying Roman history with new enthusiasm. The assassination of Caesar fascinated political thinkers because it raised timeless questions about tyranny, liberty, and the legitimacy of political violence. In the 16th century, the English playwright William Shakespeare transformed the historical episode into one of the most famous dramas ever written. His play Julius Caesar introduced the story to audiences far beyond the world of classical scholarship. Shakespeare's portrayal emphasized the emotional and moral dimensions of the assassination. Brutus appears as a thoughtful but conflicted figure, persuaded that killing Caesar is necessary to protect the Republic. The famous line, "Et tu, Brute," whether historically accurate or not, became a symbol of betrayal and tragic recognition. Through literature, the assassination entered the cultural imagination of Europe and eventually the wider world. Yet beyond the drama and symbolism, the historical event itself remains deeply instructive. The assassination of Julius Caesar illustrates how political systems can reach moments of profound tension when institutions no longer match the scale of the societies they govern. The Roman Republic had been extraordinarily successful for centuries, expanding from a small city-state into a vast Mediterranean empire. But its political structures had not evolved quickly enough to manage that expansion. Ambitious leaders filled the gaps. Caesar was one of them, but he was not the first and certainly not the last. His career demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of personal authority within a weakening constitutional framework. The conspirators believed they were defending liberty, but without stable institutions to support that liberty, their actions could not restore the past. Instead, the assassination accelerated Rome's transition into a different form of government. Augustus would rule for more than 40 years, establishing patterns of imperial administration that endured long after his death. The Roman Empire continued in the West for centuries and in the Eastern Mediterranean, what historians call the Byzantine Empire, for nearly another 1,000 years. All of that history, in one way or another, traces back to the moment when a group of senators gathered around Julius Caesar in the Senate chamber and decided that the fate of the Republic required his death. And so the question that echoes across time is not only why Caesar was assassinated, but whether the Republic he lived in could have survived at all. Because sometimes in history, the forces shaping events run deeper than the individuals who stand at the center of them. Caesar's death changed Rome forever. But the transformation of Rome had already begun long before the Ides of March. As we look back at the assassination of Julius Caesar from a distance of more than 2,000 years, it is easy to imagine the moment in the Senate chamber as the dramatic turning point where the Roman Republic finally ended. In reality, however, the event was both a climax and a symptom of deeper historical forces that had been shaping Roman politics for generations. The republic that Caesar had grown up in during the 1st century BC was already very different from the republic that had existed during Rome's earlier centuries. Originally, the Roman political system had been designed for a relatively small community. Power was divided among elected magistrates who served short terms, and the Senate provided long-term guidance through debate and consensus among aristocratic families. The system relied heavily on shared traditions, personal reputation, and an unspoken agreement that no single individual should dominate the state. For centuries, this arrangement worked remarkably well, but success brought complications. As Rome expanded across the Mediterranean world, the responsibilities of governing an empire grew far beyond what the old institutions had been designed to handle. Provincial administration required experienced commanders who could remain in office for years at a time. Military campaigns took Roman generals far from the city, where they commanded armies composed of thousands of soldiers. Victorious generals returned to Rome with wealth, prestige, and loyal followers. Over time, this process changed the balance of power inside the Republic. Political competition among elite families became more intense. Elections grew increasingly expensive, often requiring candidates to distribute money, games, and public works to gain support. Ambitious politicians relied on alliances and personal networks rather than on stable party structures. At the same time, economic inequality widened, and tensions between wealthy elites and ordinary citizens became more visible. These pressures created a political environment in which extraordinary individuals could rise rapidly. In the decades before Caesar's ascent, figures such as Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla had already demonstrated how fragile the republican system had become. Marius reformed the Roman army, allowing landless citizens to enlist, which increased the importance of generals as providers of rewards for soldiers. Sulla later marched his army directly on Rome and ruled as dictator, using proscriptions to eliminate political enemies. These precedents were not forgotten. When Julius Caesar eventually emerged as one of the most prominent leaders of his generation, he did so within a political culture already accustomed to extraordinary authority. Caesar's early career followed many traditional paths of Roman politics. He served as a military officer, worked his way through various magistracies, and cultivated alliances with influential figures. Yet from the beginning he showed unusual determination and strategic thinking. He understood that reputation, generosity, and public visibility were essential to political success in Rome. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus, later known as the First Triumvirate, demonstrated how informal power networks could reshape Roman politics. By combining their influence, the three men were able to dominate elections and legislation for several years. Caesar's subsequent command in Gaul provided him with the opportunity to build military prestige on a scale few Romans had achieved before. The Gallic campaigns transformed Caesar into one of the most famous figures in the Roman world. His victories expanded Roman territory dramatically, bringing new lands under Roman control and enormous wealth into the Republic. But perhaps even more important was the loyalty he earned from his soldiers. Years of campaigning forged strong bonds between Caesar and the legions that served under him. When political tensions later erupted into civil war, those legions became the foundation of his power. By the time Caesar returned to Rome after defeating Pompey and other opponents, the Republic's traditional balance had already collapsed. Caesar did not create the crisis by himself, but his dominance made the crisis visible in a way that could not be ignored. His reforms attempted to address some of the structural problems facing the Roman world. He reorganized the calendar into what became the Julian calendar. He restructured provincial administration to reduce corruption. He settled veterans in new colonies and introduced policies aimed at stabilizing debt. Yet his concentration of authority also created unease among the Roman elite. The office of dictator had existed in the Republic for centuries, but it was traditionally temporary, used only during emergencies and limited to short periods of time. Caesar's appointment as dictator for life was unprecedented. Even if his intentions were administrative and stabilizing, the symbolism was powerful. For senators who believed deeply in the traditions of shared governance, the idea of a permanent dictator suggested the end of the Republic. The conspirators who planned Caesar's assassination often described themselves as defenders of liberty. Many of them came from old aristocratic families that had participated in Roman politics for generations. Their sense of identity was tied closely to the republican system. Marcus Junius Brutus in particular represented that connection. His family history included associations with the early struggles against monarchy in Rome. For Brutus, the idea that Caesar might become a king, or something very close to it, carried emotional as well as political significance. Yet the conspirators faced a difficult reality. They could eliminate Caesar as an individual, but they could not easily reconstruct the political environment that had existed before him. When they struck on the Ides of March, they acted with remarkable boldness but surprisingly little long-term planning. Their expectation that the Roman people would immediately rally behind them proved incorrect. Many citizens had benefited from Caesar's leadership or simply preferred stability after years of conflict. Without widespread public support, the conspirators were forced to rely on military resources in the eastern provinces. This decision set the stage for further civil wars, drawing the Roman world into another cycle of violence. In the end, the assassination did not restore the Republic. Instead, it created a chain reaction that strengthened the position of those who inherited Caesar's political legacy. Octavian, later Augustus, learned from Caesar's experience. He recognized that power in Rome required both authority and subtlety. By preserving republican language while quietly accumulating control over the army and administration, he created a system that could function without provoking the same fears that had led to Caesar's death. The principate he established lasted for centuries. From a historical perspective, the assassination of Julius Caesar therefore occupies a fascinating place in the story of Rome. It represents both the final act of the Republic's political drama and the beginning of a new imperial order. The conspirators believed they were saving an ancient tradition of shared governance. But history rarely moves backward. By the 1st century BC, Rome had grown into a vast empire that demanded a different form of leadership. The Republic's institutions had not adapted quickly enough to manage that transformation. As a result, individuals with extraordinary ambition and ability filled the gap. Caesar was one of those individuals. His assassination revealed the limits of the old system, but it also demonstrated how difficult it was to reverse historical change once it had begun. Today, the Ides of March continues to capture the imagination of historians, writers, and audiences around the world. The event combines personal drama with profound political consequences. It reminds us that the decisions of individuals can shape the course of history, but also that those decisions unfold within broader forces that no single person fully controls. In the quiet Senate chamber where Caesar fell beneath the blows of his fellow senators, the Roman Republic experienced its most famous moment of resistance. Yet within a generation, the empire that followed would become one of the most powerful and influential political systems the world had ever seen. And so the story of Julius Caesar's assassination remains not only a tale of betrayal and ambition, but also a window into the transformation of an entire civilization. If we step back even further, the assassination of Julius Caesar becomes more than a dramatic political murder. It becomes a lens through which we can understand how large political systems struggle with success, expansion, and the concentration of power. For centuries before Caesar's time, the Roman Republic had been remarkably resilient. It survived wars with neighboring Italian states, conflicts with powerful rivals like Carthage, and internal social struggles between different classes of Roman citizens. Its political system relied not on a single ruler but on a balance between institutions, traditions, and elite competition. At the center of that system stood the Senate, composed largely of Rome's aristocratic families. Senators debated policy, guided long-term strategy, and shaped the direction of the Republic. While magistrates such as consuls technically held executive power, they served limited terms, and their authority was always subject to the broader political culture of Rome. The key word in that culture was competition. Roman aristocrats competed fiercely for prestige, military glory, and public recognition. Success in war brought triumphal parades through the city. Political victories in elections elevated reputations for generations. Families built monuments, temples, and public buildings to display their achievements. But even within this competitive environment, there was an expectation that no single man should permanently dominate the political stage. For centuries, that expectation acted as a stabilizing force. Yet the expansion of Rome's empire gradually made this balance harder to maintain. Victories in the Punic Wars during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC transformed Rome into the dominant power of the Mediterranean. With Carthage defeated, Rome gained access to enormous territories and resources. Wealth flowed into the Republic through tribute, trade, and the spoils of conquest. This prosperity, however, also created new tensions. Large estates owned by wealthy elites began to replace smaller farms worked by independent citizens. Many ordinary Romans migrated to the city in search of work and opportunity. Political leaders increasingly appealed directly to the masses, promising reforms or financial relief in exchange for support. Two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, attempted significant reforms in the 2nd century BC, including land redistribution programs designed to address inequality. Their efforts were controversial and ultimately ended in violence. Both brothers were killed in political confrontations. These events revealed something troubling about the Republic's political culture. Violence, once rare within Roman politics, was becoming more common. Over the following decades, that pattern intensified. Rival factions clashed more openly. Elections were sometimes accompanied by street fighting. Political loyalty became increasingly tied to personal alliances rather than shared civic identity. By the time Julius Caesar entered public life, the Republic had already begun moving toward a more unstable form of governance. Caesar's rise, therefore, cannot be understood in isolation. He emerged from a political system already experiencing strain. His genius lay in recognizing how to navigate that environment. Unlike many traditional aristocrats, Caesar was willing to build support among both elites and ordinary citizens. He sponsored public games, funded building projects, and spoke effectively in popular assemblies. At the same time, he maintained alliances with powerful figures such as Pompey and Crassus. His command in Gaul gave him the military achievements that Roman politics valued above all else. Roman culture admired successful generals. Victory demonstrated courage, intelligence, and divine favor. A general who expanded Roman territory was celebrated as a benefactor of the Republic. But Caesar's campaigns also raised an uncomfortable question. What happens when a general becomes too successful? The Roman political system had always assumed that victorious commanders would return to civilian life once their campaigns ended. Yet, in practice, the enormous prestige gained through military victories made that expectation difficult to enforce. When Caesar's political opponents demanded that he surrender his command and return to Rome as a private citizen, they were following the formal rules of the Republic. From Caesar's perspective, however, doing so might expose him to prosecution and political destruction. The result was the crisis that led to the crossing of the Rubicon. That moment, more than any other, symbolized the collapse of the old political norms. Once a Roman army marched into Italy under the command of its general, the balance of the Republic had already been broken. The civil war that followed did not simply pit Caesar against Pompey. It represented a struggle over the future of Roman governance. Should the Republic continue under its traditional system, even if that system was struggling to manage a vast empire? Or should a single powerful leader take responsibility for stabilizing the state? Caesar's victory suggested one answer. His assassination suggested that many Romans still hoped for another. Yet the aftermath proved that political systems cannot easily return to earlier forms once their underlying conditions have changed. The conspirators who killed Caesar believed that removing him would allow the Republic to recover. But the institutions they hoped to restore had already been weakened by decades of conflict, economic change, and imperial expansion. The armies that now determined Rome's fate were loyal to commanders rather than to the Senate. The Roman people themselves had grown accustomed to strong leaders promising stability and reform. In that environment, another figure, Octavian, could step forward and build a new political structure that combined elements of both systems. Augustus's empire retained the language and many ceremonies of the Republic. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates were elected, and laws were passed through traditional channels. But ultimate authority rested with the emperor. This arrangement proved remarkably durable. For many Romans, it offered the stability that the late Republic had failed to provide. The empire would govern vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for centuries. And yet, even under imperial rule, the memory of the Republic never entirely disappeared. Roman writers continued to reflect on the ideals of earlier generations. Philosophers debated the nature of liberty and authority. Historians described the rise and fall of political leaders with both admiration and caution. The assassination of Julius Caesar remained central to these reflections. For some, it represented a noble attempt to defend freedom against tyranny. For others, it illustrated the dangers of political idealism disconnected from practical reality. Either way, the event became a permanent part of Rome's historical identity. Today, when historians examine the Ides of March, they see not just a single act of violence, but the culmination of long-term transformations within Roman society. The Republic had grown too large, too complex, and too divided to function as it once had. Caesar's death did not create that problem. It revealed it, and in doing so, it helped usher in a new era of Roman history, one that would shape the political and cultural development of much of the world that followed. The Senate chamber where Caesar fell has long since vanished. The Roman Republic itself exists only in history books and archaeological remains. But the questions raised by that moment, the balance between liberty and authority, the dangers of concentrated power, and the challenges of governing large societies, remain just as relevant today as they were in ancient Rome. And perhaps that is why the story of Julius Caesar's assassination continues to be told, studied, and debated after more than 2 millennia. As historians continue to reflect on the assassination of Julius Caesar, another dimension becomes increasingly important: how the event changed the psychology of Roman politics. The Ides of March was not only a turning point in government structures, it also permanently altered how Roman leaders thought about power, loyalty, and survival. Before Caesar, ambitious Roman politicians certainly feared rivals, but assassination inside the Senate itself had been extremely rare. Roman political violence usually occurred in street clashes, riots, or during civil war campaigns. The idea that senators, members of the Republic's governing body, would collectively murder the most powerful man in Rome during a formal meeting was shocking even to those accustomed to political conflict. In the years that followed, Roman leaders absorbed a quiet but powerful lesson. Political authority had to be secured not only through legitimacy, but also through personal security and careful image management. Augustus understood this lesson better than anyone. Although he ruled the Roman world, Augustus rarely appeared surrounded by excessive military force inside the city of Rome itself. Instead, he cultivated an image of moderation and restraint. He spoke of himself as the servant of the Republic rather than its master. He attended Senate meetings, respected traditional ceremonies, and avoided overt displays of royal power. This approach helped reassure the Roman aristocracy that they still had a role to play within the state. Yet Augustus also quietly ensured that no group of senators could ever repeat what had happened to Caesar. The loyalty of the Roman legions ultimately rested with him. Key administrative positions were held by trusted allies. Political rivals were carefully monitored or neutralized before they could become dangerous. In other words, Augustus combined the appearance of republican tradition with the reality of centralized control. Later emperors learned similar lessons. Throughout the early Roman Empire, rulers remained deeply aware of the risks posed by conspiracies within elite circles. Some emperors ruled cautiously, maintaining cooperative relationships with the Senate. Others ruled with suspicion and harsh repression. But the memory of Caesar's assassination lingered as a warning. Even centuries later, Roman writers continued to discuss the event in ways that revealed its lasting psychological impact. Tacitus, writing in the 1st century AD, often reflected on the tension between imperial authority and senatorial freedom. Although Tacitus lived long after the Republic had disappeared, his histories frequently returned to the question of how power should be balanced in a vast empire. In Tacitus's view, the assassination of Caesar symbolized the moment when that balance became impossible to maintain. From a broader historical perspective, the event also highlights an enduring problem faced by many political systems: how to manage success. The Roman Republic was extraordinarily successful in expanding its territory and influence. Yet the institutions that governed the Republic had been designed for a much smaller political community. As Rome grew larger, wealthier, and more complex, the gap between the Republic's traditional structures and the demands of empire widened. This mismatch created opportunities for individuals with exceptional ability and ambition. Caesar was one such individual. His rise revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Roman political culture. The Republic encouraged competition, rewarded achievement, and celebrated military success. But those same values could elevate leaders whose authority exceeded the limits of the system designed to contain them. The conspirators recognized the danger but misjudged the solution. By focusing on Caesar as the problem, they overlooked the deeper transformations that had reshaped Roman politics. Killing Caesar removed a man, but it did not remove the conditions that had allowed him to rise. As the Roman Empire settled into the long period of stability that followed Augustus's rise, the memory of Julius Caesar's assassination gradually transformed from a recent political crisis into something closer to historical legend. Yet the deeper questions raised by the event never fully disappeared from Roman thought. Instead, they evolved into enduring debates about leadership, loyalty, and the limits of political power. For the Romans who lived under the early emperors, the Republic was no longer a living political system. It had become a memory, sometimes idealized, sometimes criticized, but always influential. Writers, philosophers, and historians looked back on the final century of the Republic as a dramatic period when Rome struggled to adapt to the responsibilities of empire. The assassination of Caesar stood at the center of those reflections. Some Roman authors viewed the conspirators with sympathy. They argued that Caesar's accumulation of honors and lifelong dictatorship threatened the very foundations of Roman liberty. In this interpretation, the assassins acted out of a sense of civic duty, even if their plan ultimately failed. Other writers, however, emphasized the chaos that followed Caesar's death. From this perspective, the conspirators had misjudged the political reality of their time. By removing the one leader capable of controlling Rome's rival factions, they unleashed a wave of conflict that proved even more destructive than Caesar's rule might have been. Both interpretations contained elements of truth. What the conspirators perhaps underestimated most was how deeply Roman society had changed by the mid-1st century BC. The Republic had been built upon shared traditions and a delicate balance of authority among elite families. But centuries of expansion had produced an empire that stretched across thousands of miles and included millions of inhabitants from diverse cultures. Managing such a vast system required coordination on a scale that earlier Roman institutions had never been designed to handle. In practice, this meant that individual leaders with strong armies and administrative experience increasingly became indispensable. Generals governed provinces, collected taxes, negotiated with local rulers, and defended Rome's borders. Their authority in these distant regions often exceeded anything imagined by the Republic's founders. Caesar had simply pushed that dynamic further than anyone before him. His victories in Gaul created not only territorial expansion but also a powerful personal following among soldiers and citizens alike. His reforms in Rome addressed genuine problems within the state. Yet his concentration of authority also alarmed those who believed that the Republic's survival depended on limiting any one man's power. The assassination was therefore not just a reaction to Caesar himself, but to what he represented. The possibility that Rome's traditional political order might be replaced by permanent personal rule. Ironically, the aftermath proved that such a transformation had already begun. Octavian's rise demonstrated how thoroughly the political landscape had shifted. Unlike Caesar, Octavian rarely presented himself as a revolutionary figure. Instead, he emphasized continuity with Roman tradition. His careful language suggested that he was restoring stability rather than creating a new system. But the structure he built quietly changed the nature of Roman government. The emperor held command over the legions stationed in the most important provinces. He influenced legislation through special powers granted by the Senate. He controlled key administrative offices and maintained networks of loyal supporters across the empire. These powers ensured that the emperor could guide Roman policy in ways that Republican magistrates had never been able to do. At the same time, Augustus understood that public perception mattered greatly. He avoided the title of king, which remained deeply unpopular among Romans. Instead, he adopted titles such as princeps, the first citizen, and Augustus, a word suggesting reverence and dignity rather than domination. By preserving the outward forms of the Republic, he reduced the likelihood that senators would view his rule as tyranny. This balance between appearance and reality became one of the defining characteristics of Roman imperial governance. Later emperors followed similar patterns with varying degrees of success. Some respected the traditions Augustus had established, cooperating with the Senate and maintaining the image of shared governance. Others ruled more openly as autocrats, relying heavily on military support and suppressing opposition. Yet, even during periods of stronger imperial authority, the memory of the Republic continued to influence Roman political culture. Senators still spoke about the virtues of earlier generations. Public ceremonies celebrated Rome's ancient traditions. Historians compared contemporary leaders with figures from the Republican past. Within this context, the story of Julius Caesar's assassination retained enormous symbolic power. It represented the moment when Romans attempted to defend their traditional system against the rise of personal rule. The fact that the attempt failed did not diminish its significance. Instead, it provided later generations with a dramatic example of the tension between liberty and authority that runs through many political systems. Outside Rome, the consequences of Caesar's assassination were equally profound. The Roman Empire that emerged after the civil wars eventually became one of the most influential political entities in world history. Roman law shaped legal systems across Europe and beyond. Roman engineering transformed landscapes with roads, aqueducts, and cities. Latin language and literature influenced the development of Western education and culture for centuries. All of this unfolded within the imperial structure that arose from the Republic's collapse. Had Caesar not been assassinated, it is possible that Rome might still have moved toward imperial rule, but perhaps through a different path. Caesar himself may have attempted to establish a monarchy more openly, or he might have developed a different form of centralized leadership. Because the assassination interrupted his plans, we cannot know with certainty how his rule would have evolved. What we can see clearly is that the conspirators' attempt to restore the Republic did not achieve its intended result. Instead, their actions accelerated the transformation of Roman governance. By eliminating Caesar, they created the conditions for new leaders to compete for power. Those struggles eventually produced the empire under Augustus, a political system that preserved stability for centuries, but fundamentally altered the nature of Roman authority. In that sense, the Ides of March stands as one of history's great turning points. Inside the Senate chamber on that day, a group of senators believed they were acting in defense of tradition and liberty. Their daggers struck down one of the most powerful figures the Roman world had ever seen. But the republic they hoped to save was already fading. In the decades that followed, Rome would adapt to its new imperial identity, expanding its influence across continents and shaping the course of world history. Yet even as emperors ruled from the Palatine Hill and Roman legions marched across distant frontiers, the memory of Julius Caesar's assassination remained a quiet reminder of the fragile balance between power and freedom. And perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate today. Because beneath the marble statues and ancient ruins lies a timeless question, one that every political society must eventually confront. How much power can a single leader hold before the system that created that power begins to change forever?